Somehow that just seemed right after a long-ass day, didn't it? And it seemed right for another way as well, because if you are into the music and into the words, you realize that song says, "What do you want from me and my scars?" Everybody lacked confidence, everybody lacked confidence. How many times our potential was anonymous? How many times the city making me promises? So I promise this, I love myself. It's actually kind of an appropriate way to think about both what happened 25 years ago and also the remarkable self-confidence and promise that South LA has right now about itself. Certainly, it was the scars of deindustrialization, excess incarceration, people fleeing, the wars in Central America and economic desperation in Mexico, that fed into what blew up in Los Angeles 25 years ago. There were scars. And too many people felt like their potential was anonymous, unrecognized by school systems, unrecognized by a police department that was more of an occupying force than anything else, a police department that was the first in the nation to own its own tank, and that ran things like Operation Hammer. What a community-friendly way to operate. Anonymous. And in 1992, part of what happened was people no longer wanting to be anonymous and wanting to realize the promises that had been made. But it's taken, I think, 25 years of good, solid organizing, some of the best organizers in America up here, to get us to the point where the promise can be seen. But, as we'll see in a little while, where not much yet has changed. Policing's better, but still problematic. The poverty rates in South LA are roughly what the poverty rates were 25 years ago, but things are perhaps on the cusp of change. And so it becomes important to think about how do we move that change forward. This panel is called Which Way South LA? Some of you in the know will remember that there was a radio program after the uprising called Which Way LA? So this is my shot at having that radio program, which I always wanted to do. Damn, Warren Olney. But that radio program after the LA civil unrest, moderated by Warren Olney, became a place to dissect what had happened and to try to chart a road ahead. It was a key public square that began to challenge some of the media myths about the civil unrest. The media myth that it was just a black-white or Korean-black affair, when in fact 51% of those who were arrested were Latino, and that the neighborhoods in which the unrest occurred were roughly 50% Latino. That somehow Latinos, because on the east side there wasn't a lot of participation, hadn't participated. This was actually a wake-up call for Latino political leaders as well to realize there were Latinos in South LA that they had no connection with. And it was a wake-up call too, because while the media portrayed it mostly as being driven by the issues of police brutality, which were a factor. What the media really missed was that where the unrest occurred were neighborhoods that had twice the unemployment rate, twice the poverty rate, half the home ownership, half the per capita income. It was a bread riot. It was an expression of the economic distress. And Which Way LA became one of the many venues to have a conversation about that. Warren only did a public service by reaching out to so many different people, getting so many different stories, and making them an important part of thinking about where we needed to go. Flash forward 25 years, and we see a very different South LA in some ways, but we see the same media misperception. I'm sure many of you on the panel, some of you in the audience, have had your obligatory every 5-year call from reporters from the East Coast, in which they say, aren't things exactly the same as before? And they say South LA is, for example, a place of disinvestment, right? And the truth is, for so many of you who spend time in South LA, that it's a place of public disinvestment, but it's a place of tremendous private pride of place. You go from the tattered boulevards where the public sector hasn't contributed and where the commercial corridors have sometimes been weak, and what you find are well-tended homes, tremendous pride of place, which is something that puts South LA now at the risk of gentrification. South LA is portrayed by these reporters as a place of challenge, and it is. But what they miss is South LA as a place of resistance and a place of resilience. These reporters talk about South LA as a place of black-brown conflict, thinking about stories from 25 years ago, although they seem to miss the fact that African Americans and Latinos looted together, kind of a rainbow coalition on that. And what they miss are the stories of these great community organizations bringing in particular African Americans and Latinos together. And they portray South LA as a place simply of desperation. They don't catch South LA as a place of renaissance, poised for renaissance, and worried about how to make sure that goes right. So what we're going to try to do with this panel today is to get the story right. To get the story right about what happened, what's changed and what hasn't changed, what's ahead, and also something that I think a lot of the reporters also don't catch, why what's going on in South LA is actually a model for the rest of the country. Why, not to coin a phrase, although I might have coined this phrase, South LA is the future, which, by the way, Tamu is, and all of you, is the name of a great march and rally you should go to this Saturday, which starts at the corner of Florence and Normandy, which was a place of violence, but will be a place of reawakening. And then it marches for about an hour, although I don't know how you can take that long. You must be walking like this.
It'll be so many people. It'll be so many people.
It's just going to be so many people. To the brand new community coalition building at 81st and Vermont. We'll talk a little bit more about this, but the themes of that march is South LA is home, South LA is the future. You should all go and be a part of this. So quickly, my name is Manuel Pastor. Aside from directing the Program for Environmental and Regional Equity, I am the Turpanjian Chair in Civil Society and Social Change. Now, I may not look like a chair. I'm a professor, but what that means is that I have an endowed chair. By the way, it's not an upholstered chair, so it's not quite that comfortable, but it is an endowed chair. And one of the things that we try to do as part of this is to each year host a conversation about community organizing, social change, civil society, and this seemed to be the appropriate one. So this particular session, part of the broader conference, is sponsored in particular by the Turpanjian chair, but even today's particular panel would not be possible without our wonderful co-sponsors, the USC Price School for Social Policy, Saul Price Center for Social Innovation, the Spatial Analysis Lab of USC, USC RAP, Race Arts and Placemaking faculty, and USC Dornsife Alumni Relations. Let's give them all a hand. So we have a pretty stellar panel here. You can look up their bios, so I won't spend any time really on doing that. I'll just quickly introduce them. Larry Frank, president of LA Trade Tech College, not too far away, which would miss the storied history of Larry Frank, who was doing voter engagement work in South LA and broadly in Los Angeles through the 80s and even earlier. Larry looks like he's 20 years old, but he's been around changing the world. He was deputy mayor for Antonio Viracocha. Let's give it up for Larry Frank. Gloria Walton, who's president and CEO of SCOPE, one of the organizations that sort of emerged out of the wake of the Los Angeles civil unrest. She actually grew up in Mississippi and then decided that living in Mississippi was not challenging enough, so she moved to Los Angeles to try to change the world here. Let's give it up for Gloria Walton. We also have with us Soraya Montes-Rodriguez. She's Executive Vice President of Community Coalition, one of the most dynamic young leaders I know. Also South LA raised, and with some fascinating stories about both growing up and actually the days in the unrest. Let's give it up for Aurea. And then we have Tanua Thrash-Ntuk. She's now executive director of LISC. I like to say I knew her when, because now she's all big time, LISC and stuff. But she's been doing great community development work for years before she had at the West Angeles Community Development Corporation. Let's give it up for Tanua.
Thank you.
Then, the remarkable Pete White. Executive Director and founder of Los Angeles Community Action Network, South LA, South Central, you would proudly say,
right.
Born and raised. And like Gloria, who thought Mississippi was not tough enough, Pete decided that the problems in South LA were not a challenge, so he decided to organize on Skid Row, because, as we'll talk about, that's where a lot of folks from South LA got shunted to because of the over-criminalization, the lack of treatment facilities, et cetera. Really one of the major voices for social justice in Southern California. Let's give it up for Pete White. So I'm gonna jump around, not quite in order, but I think you all know the questions, and give you all just a few seconds to start with 1992 and its legacy. Where were you in 92, and what do you think of as its legacy? And actually, Pete, we'll start, you're to my immediate right, but I know Pete, he's actually pretty far to my left.
You definitely need to keep the day job.
Yeah.
So me and Manuel, we do this. We're doing this more and more, and I like hanging out with Manuel. I'll just say quickly, April 29th, 1992. So just so folks know, I grew up right around the corner from here on Western and Exposition. And I could recall, and my mother still lives there, and I'm leaving, when I leave here running out, I'm gonna go and see my mother because it was her birthday yesterday. And so still got deep roots and ain't going nowhere. I remember April 29th, I had actually been out of the military for about a year, right? And I'm sitting with my mother in her, because I'm a mama's boy, you'll hear my mother a lot in these stories. I'm sitting in her living room and we're waiting on the verdict. The verdict comes down and the sort of silence was palpable, right? So in the house, there was just this calm riot. My mother, who came to Los Angeles in the 50s from Louisiana, fleeing repression in Louisiana and not knowing that Chief Parker was actually recruiting police officers from Louisiana to patrol South Central Los Angeles. And so I was sitting in the living room, and the verdict came out and there was quiet, just quiet. But then outside, in the neighborhood and on the block, I just heard, and I won't use all the words here today, I just heard, not again, not again, not again. And you just felt the weight that was hanging in the air, right? And you just knew there was something that connected all of those voices, sort of connected all of that energy, that not this time, right? This time, this decision, this moment wasn't going to end like many other moments ended. And that's where I was when the rebellion and not riot started.
I still remember that too. I compare the moment. I had the unpleasant experience of being in Cuba right before a hurricane, and I don't recommend that, by the way. And that moment of the wind whistling down the street before the hurricane hits, it felt just like that afternoon. Mm-hmm. Tanu, where were you? What was your experience like?
So born and raised, I say South Central all the time.
All right.
And as I grew older and it became South LA, it almost felt like something was taken away from me. In 1992, I was a high school student. And I was, they were trying to make sure that kids got home and people, got to back to their communities per se. And for me, I had, really thought that this was sort of a defining moment because I thought in my family I was going to be the first to go to college. So it was, I had been raised in the Black church in my community. I was in my grandmother's home. There were a lot of resources, being pulled into me as the first one to go to college. And the idea was, we're doing that so that you can become a lawyer because the criminal justice system needs someone like you. And so when this verdict came down, here I am, a young woman in high school. I had been invisibly homeless. I had been housing insecure my entire life. I did not have health care growing up, which meant I had to wait 90 days to have a surgery that the state had deemed not life-threatening, but certainly necessary. So I had to stay home the entire time to make sure that I stayed safe. I grew up food and nutrition insecure, the kinds of things that I had to eat in order to maintain myself. And I ended up in magnet schools, but it was clear that the schools in my community were very poor and didn't have all of the resources. And one teacher told my mother, "Your daughter has promise, let's send her at least to the magnet schools." I had, grew up on a street where today we talk about environmental injustice. 98th and Figueroa, for those of you who know it, know that there are power lines up and down my street. I played on those power lines, and my street dead-ended into the 110 freeway. So I was breathing in all of the air and all of the people who had jobs and opportunity in that traffic that is the 110 freeway in my community. And I just knew, I said, yes, I'm going to be the first in my family to go to college. I'm going to become that lawyer, and I know that the justice system works. And when I got home from school and the verdict was read, I was devastated. I realized that, all those things that I had been experiencing, me and my family, I didn't even have names for them like I do now, that something was wrong. And I could feel there was anger in me, there was anger in my household, there was anger in my community, on my block. And I knew something was going to happen because not too far from my house on 98th and Figueroa, there had been just a few months earlier, the Latasha Harlan story. And I say her name because that could have been me. Mm-hmm. All of those things that I talk about that I grew up with, I should not be here today. And so there was all of this tension in communities. So when that came down, certainly my family actually began to prepare, and people knew because they had participated in and were part of the riots of '65 that something was going to happen that day.
Great, let's turn to Orea. Orea, I know a little bit about your story, and it makes me think that you and Tanua were sisters.
I agree. I feel like Tanua shared my story. I came to South Central Los Angeles in 1979 as a child from Mexico, and I too, in middle school, got tracked to go to college. So teachers at Carver Junior High who saw potential in those of us who they kept away from all of the gang activity, all of the drug activity that was tearing families apart, said we had to go to magnet schools. And so I actually went to Roosevelt High School magnet program and came home on April 29th. And we actually had just moved to the city of Compton because we couldn't afford our single apartment for a family of 6. So we had moved to a converted garage in the city of Compton. That was our house, and we felt great because we had 2 bedrooms that we, could enjoy, and we were on a block that reminded me a lot of what South Los Angeles felt like when I first moved in 1979, where African-American families had lived on that street and that neighborhood of Compton for decades. And so the pride that people had for their homes was great, the way that I had experienced as a child. And so I actually, with my siblings and my parents, saw the verdict and was outraged and furious, but for me, it wasn't surprising because Latasha Harlins had been killed, and because my brother and I had experienced encounters with the police where one time we were going into a hamburger place and he made a left crossing a yellow line, and the police stopped us and they put a rifle on my brother's head, and they turned to me and said, if you stay quiet, profanity, nothing will happen to him. And we had experienced that, and here I was, a college-bound kid. So on April 30th, I actually got up, went to school, to Roosevelt, and the principal gets on the PA system early in the morning and says, those of you who are bused need to hurry up and get to the buses because the mayor announced a state of emergency and the buses will stop running. We made it all the way to Imperial Highway, and I had to walk for about 3 miles to get to my house while businesses were looted, while businesses had gone up in flames. Business owners who were trying to protect their businesses, especially at the Compton Swap Meet, were pointing guns at us, and not at me per se, but at anyone who would intentionally go onto their businesses. And still my brother and I, when he got home from San Pedro High, because he was bused to San Pedro, he said, let's get in his truck and let's go see what's happening. And we did. And it wasn't until...
That must have made your parents very happy.
This is the children of immigrants, right? And so we get in his car, and it wasn't until the truck driver who was in front of me, of us, gets out of his car to put a television on his truck, and somebody takes his truck while he's trying to get the television, that we realize we need to get home.
Yeah, I would think so. So, those are such evocative stories. Gloria, I know you're both younger and grew up in a different place, but you, by the way, I should have mentioned this. For the students who are in the audience, I think it's important for you to know that Gloria started Scope as an intern, and now she's president and CEO. So if you're bitching about your internship, don't. But Gloria, you kind of arrived seeing the legacy of '92 and how it sort of shaped how people thought, how people organized. What was your experience both as sort of distantly watching it and then arriving to encounter its legacy?
Yes, so as Manuel said, I'm from Jackson, Mississippi, and in 1992, I was actually a child. Nonetheless, I do remember that night over dinner, because we were 2 hours ahead in Mississippi, my uncles and and I'm saying my uncles because my mom was the house where everybody came to our house. So all my uncles lived with us, and my aunties stayed there sometimes, and the cousins were there, so we were just like a big family. And I just remember the anger that everyone felt. And it's interesting being a child experiencing that, because my great-grandmother, you know, had 15 siblings, and she had 10 kids of her own, and my grandmother had 10 children. So this is a very big family that I come from. And with my uncles, all of them were chronically under and unemployed, homeless, which is why they stayed with us off and on. My aunts married men like my uncles, you know, and really what this is painting are the material conditions of the community. And my mother was a single mom, and she worked at a warehouse, and she essentially picked up boxes and took them off manufacturing trucks and put them back on trucks. And she did that for all my childhood, and worked full-time, still on public assistance, trying to make ends meet. So these are the material conditions that I grew up with. This is the anger that people felt after hearing this verdict, something that I didn't quite understand as much as a child. But growing up, I really began to understand that my story was different from a lot of people at the school that I went to, for example, because I was bused to a different school. I understood that while my story was different from all the white people that I went to school with, it was actually not an anomaly in the community that I came from. And so leaving Mississippi wasn't necessarily about, for me, the problems weren't enough. The problems were really too much. And I was in high school becoming depressed, right? And so these are the conditions that young children of color are living with and end up having all kinds of impacts from it. And so for myself, it was, you know, deeply unhappy, deeply angry, and thinking that if I went west, that was opportunity. If I left my community, I can do better for myself and my family. And so the funny thing is, all these years later, everyone knows about the Great Migration from the South, when people went north and went west for opportunity. And here I am, all these years later, doing that same trajectory, looking for opportunity. So I go to UCLA. I'm thinking I want to be a lawyer too. I was a UCLA law fellow, excelling in school. A professor tells me about the UCLA Labor Center. But prior to that, he asked if I wanted to be an organizer. I didn't grow up in a union household. I didn't grow up with my family being activists in organizations. So I didn't know about, you know, the civil rights and all. That was Dr. Martin Luther King, 1960s. You learn about that stuff, but I didn't know it was going on today. So I was a verdant youth. So when I'm hearing organizer, I'm just like, what? This man thinks I want to organize parties? Like, this is not, I'm offended. You know, here I come here, this black girl with this white teacher who I thought was a good teacher. And he was actually quite great, Professor Paul Van Blum, who I really need to go back and let him know how he pivoted and transformed my life. But anyways, once I got past that and recognized that he was actually seeing something in me that I didn't see in myself, and I went to the Labor Center, met Larry Frank. So Larry and I go way back. He's family for me. Kent Wong, and you know, I was sitting in his office and I'm like, I don't know where you guys should place me wherever you think I'm gonna be a good fit. This is all new for me. I'm here for the summer to do this internship, and then I'm on my way to law school. And sure enough, him, this young man named Blinker, placed me at Scope with Anthony Thigpen. They were like, that's where you need to be. And my first day, I kid you not, I was on the doors talking to people about problems and conditions, asking them what do they feel like are the top issues. I had to hit the phones, doing cold calls, completely intimidated, but also refreshed, because being in that UCLA bubble, it was a very different experience from when I started organizing in South Los Angeles, and I saw people who looked like me and my family. And I went to my first house meeting and saw people talking about change and talking about the conditions that they're living with, and more importantly, talking about a vision that they want for their own communities. So reclaiming their own stories and telling their own narratives, talking about power, talking about change, using this tool called the power analysis that we've coined. And it was that day that I learned one of the most important lessons in this work, which is that decisions really are being made every single day on my behalf and everyone's behalf in this room by just regular people. And either I can sit on the side complaining, or I can be alongside these grassroots leaders of South Los Angeles who look like my family, talking about power, building power, and affecting change. And so I chose to be an agent of social change with those leaders. 2 years into it, I deferred law school for 2 years. I had to make a decision, and here I am going on 15 years later, doing this work.
Well, I'm glad you made that decision.
Yes.
And I guess I'm glad that Larry recruited you. So Larry, we're a little bit of the same generation in terms of having been active in the 80s before you, much more than me. I mean, more active.
I'm older.
More active, not older. But there was a sense of things might come apart, but people trying to figure out how to put them together. And then all of a sudden, the world blows up in '92 for people who were trying to do this work. Where were you? What shock waves did it send through you? How did it change you?
So I spent my 80s as a hardcore organizer, starting the labor movement, then did a bunch of community organizing, then I did political organizing. And we were building a precinct organization. It was our theory, home-based precinct organization, people responsible for the 3 blocks around their house and building politics. And the Rodney King video blew us all apart, right? As we kind of saw it play out. And it was, we had just finished up the 1990 elections. We were getting ready for the 1992 elections. We had put together our coalition of about 60 organizations, getting people to sign contracts for the 3 blocks around their house, building up our precinct organization. The key issue on the ballot, was Charter Amendment F, which was the result of the Christopher Commission looking at the police in the review system of police officers. Right, so we were in the thick of it. We were out walking, precincts all over Los Angeles in support of Measure F, Charter Amendment F, to what it did ultimately do is it added 1 civilian to the police review panel, right? It allowed you to go back and pick up prior evidence of misconduct, even if it wasn't verified, that could be used during the police review process. And it was something that, we thought, well, this is a concrete thing we can be fighting for, right? And, so April 29th comes around. I was born April 30th. It was my 39th birthday, yes, so that makes me 64 next week or on Sunday. Freaks me out, everybody. The sixth one freaks you out, right? It was a total gut check for all of us that were doing work in terms of what are we doing, right? What relevance is it to what was really going on and being felt in the communities we were trying to make a difference in? And Gary Phillips is here, Larry Aubrey's here. There are people that were deep, deep, deep into this work. I had done it for years, but I ended up jumping into law school. So I'm a newly minted attorney. Went late in life to become an attorney to see if that would be something I could do. But was working almost full time also on the '92 election. And obviously it seemed a little bit irrelevant at that moment, right? Obviously nobody came to my birthday party. Only kidding. But it was a kind of a gut check moment for all progressives. Anthony, I also had the great pleasure to work with Anthony Thigpen. My, vote for best organizer I've ever worked with, right? it for him was a gut check moment. He kind of said, okay, you know, I gotta retreat from this work and kind of start and see if I can build something a little bit more genuine, where he started up agenda first and then scope, right? You know, I ended up going and, you know, doing a criminal sentencing practice for a while and got deep into, did a lot of work, you know, on Prop 36, if people remember that. But first thing I did right after the riots is I was working with the National Lawyers Guild. There were hundreds and hundreds of unrepresented folks that had been picked up and swept up, you know, by the riots themselves, by the uprising. And I think I probably did about 30 cases, right? It was kind of digging in terms of my own criminal justice practice. And so I got a deep understanding of what was going on, because I had to dig in deep in terms of people's lives. But it was a moment where people had to really reconsider in the movement what we were doing and where we were going as a movement. And so I was part of those conversations in the aftermath as well, which was an interesting period.
Great, and as Marquise was commenting today at lunch, there was a flowering of all these great organizations that tried to figure out what we could do in this moment. I want to come back to Pete, who I think is the only person on the panel who seems to have neither considered going to law school or completed law school. In your view, what's changed and what hasn't? When you look at South Central, South LA today, what's changed? What hasn't and remains a big challenge?
So I have a short answer and a long answer. I'm going to go for the short answer first. People have changed, but the conditions have remained the same. In many ways, have gotten worse. I think about 1992, and when you think about unemployment in South Central Los Angeles in 1992, citywide, there were 2.3 people for every job, right? Citywide. But in South Central Los Angeles, it was 4.5 people for every one job, right? That's 1992. And then you move forward to 1999, right? And in 1999, it ticks down citywide in terms of the unemployment rate. It's 2.8 people per one job citywide, but in South Central Los Angeles, it's now 7.8 people per one job. And so there was a lot of celebratory sort of talk in 92 after the rebellion, Rebuild LA, that we are really going to invest, right, in a Los Angeles that we could all be proud of. However, that investment never materialized, right? But what did materialize post-1992, we saw a Clinton crime bill in 1994 that led to a massive expansion of prisons. We saw the Welfare Reform Act shortly thereafter that began to shrink an already non-existent safety net. And so we saw all of these pressures on South Central LA, and the best that we could get, fast forward in April 2003, was the renaming of South Central LA in hopes of that changing the conditions, right? And so oftentimes people ask the question, what has changed? What is better? I will say it is a bittersweet question, because I do believe what has happened as a result of the organized abandonment and malign neglect is that there rose all of these very powerful organizations and these ideas around, and this is for us, Tamu, the 4 drivers of disparity, right? So people were really now linking the causes of gross police suppression, right, to issues of runaway unemployment, right, to issues of housing insecurity, right, that created a corridor of poverty between South Central Los Angeles and downtown Los Angeles. And let me just say, when I was growing up, there was really no separation between those two. Like when you were in downtown, people pretty much thought that was South Central LA as well. And then lastly, environmental racism. And so in that 25 years, you saw this coming together, right, in almost human rights fashion of all of these issues. And we knew that sort of the silo-based ways in which we had been organizing had to stop. The other thing that that 25 years represents, and this is where it's the more sweet than the bitter, it was sort of the next emergence, because you talked about, Manuel, deindustrialization. And we think about, specifically when we're talking about South Central Los Angeles and African Americans, you think about the steel companies. You think about the rubber companies. You think about all of these manufacturing plants that are shuttered up and down Slauson. Those were sites, both of where people were working, but also sites of labor organizing, right? And so with deindustrialization, sort of that organizing potential that ran into 1965 was gone. And so post-1992, I believe it's a rebirth of a new sort of civic engagement, a new sort of power-building engagement that we're realizing right now. And for the shameless plug, this Saturday, where South LA is the future, 12 o'clock, clap that up, South LA is the future. Yes, clap that up. And we are going to have a visioning, looking forward conversation with all of these organizations and folks from South Central Los Angeles about where we go from here. Because the threats are real, the threats are here, and we need to bury down.
That's going to be a great segue into the next question. But I did want to point out that Pete might not have known that this conference was about how data is so useful for change. And he was just showing his data jobs there, right? Jobs per resident. To know in your view, and I'm not going to ask everybody that's going to move to where we are now, what's changed and what hasn't? And I'm particularly interested because this is a conference not just about data, but about placemaking. And that's been an important part of your work with West Angeles, and now, of course, with LISC.
So when we first started talking about this idea of what's changed, what hasn't, as I guess it's been made clear, I decided not to go to law school. And what I instead decided to do is I told my mom, I said, I see people on TV, they're talking about, what can we do? My family was very nervous. They're like, no, you can't get out there and start talking to those folks. And I said, no, I want to go out there. I want to rebuild LA. And for me, I talked about like my love for South LA, for South Central Los Angeles, has never gone anywhere. So my family loves South Central Los Angeles. My people still live in the neighborhood, and people are all throughout. So my grandmother and her 7 sisters and her 1 brother who came to LA all live within a couple of blocks of one another. And so I have a sense of community with that. What I'm seeing now is that there are other people who are now developing a love of South Central Los Angeles. And as a result, all of my efforts, even as a professional at West Angeles, in trying to create the place that I knew that where my family lived, where I want to see economic opportunity for people, where I want to try and make sure that there is industry coming and that there's connections to that, to those opportunities via transit, via other programs. I wanted to make sure more people had an opportunity to purchase homes in this community and to really remain anchored in that. And so part of what I'm seeing change is that, yes, I still have that love, but there are others. And part of what I'm concerned about is how do I make sure that all of the hard work and the efforts that I have put into creating place in the Crenshaw district in particular are people benefit who have been there for a long time. They aren't displaced. And it's not just the people, it's the small businesses too. There are small businesses who this is their livelihood. For some folks, this is generational sweat, blood, and tears of putting together a business that really feeds the culture and the place of these neighborhoods. So those are some of the things that I'm concerned about and that I'm looking at going forward. at LISC, my shameless plug is that we've got some of the tools at our disposal. And it really is about making sure that we've got the investment so that those tools can be used on a wide scale basis. How do we make sure that the capital is flowing to the projects we want to see happen? We've got Metro Board member Jackie DuPont Walker here. How do we make sure that the investment of the $1.2 billion Crenshaw to LAX line benefits the people who are there? They're working on those lines. The small businesses are gaining access to the contracts as part of that huge wealth transfer. So I'm excited that other people love South Central just as much, but I want to make sure that they know that they're coming into context and that there's an expectation that when they get there, that they remember that there are people who've been here for some time already.
That's right.
That's a deep message. The way I interpret that, excuse me, is I'm really glad you love me, but I want to make sure you love me. Right? That is, to really know what South LA is, what its history, its legacy, and the people who are there. Aurea, looking forward, and this is really a good jumping spot to that, what do you see as the challenges and opportunities?
So it's difficult for me to talk about looking forward without just saying a couple of things. One, I'm with Pete. My brother and I used to take the bus on 41st and Broadway and go into downtown. That was our weekend trip with $2, and we bought a gift from our mom, and we made sure we could get back with our transfer, which was free, and it was all one big place, and it was safe for us to do that as children. You know, the second thing is, this June I am gonna celebrate 20 years with Community Coalition, and I think that I share that for two reasons. One, because there are people in this room that you've already acknowledged, like Larry, folks not in this room, like our founder, Karen Bass, our former CEO, Marquise Harris-Dawson, folks who really spent the time building long-term leadership for the community, both building folks that could go into elected office to be champions for racial and economic justice, right, for our community, for South Los Angeles, and really doing the organizing, believing that everyday people in South Los Angeles are the drivers of change, and that we've won some really big things. So I think I agree with everything that Pete said, but I also want to acknowledge that young people have made college-going classes a civil rights in South LA. Young people have been leading the fight to address issues of school climate and over-policing, and they've made significant progress in ensuring that we don't continue to overly suspend and expel Black and brown young boys, so that we actually can move from our experience of tracking a few young people to having all students, making sure that they have the opportunity not just to graduate, but to be college ready. And organizations sitting here at on this panel have really worked hard to build an electoral strategy statewide to bring new revenue to the state around public education with Prop 30, LCFF, with Prop 47 to stop the cycle of incarcerating people from our community, that addiction, that revolving door that brought many of us into activism, and then looking at what kind of revenue is going to come to our communities from all of the measures around the housing, right, both in terms of affordable housing and services for homeless and vulnerable populations. All of this work, I think that we really have to recognize in terms of progress that we have made. And for me, that's important because one of the persons that I really respect, giants, right, in terms of leaders, Reverend Lawson said, one of the things that community organizers have to ask themselves in this time period, similar to that reality gut check that you had, Larry, is whether we're doing activism for activism's sake, or are we doing organizing to build power and to win tangible changes for our community. And the reason I stay involved is because I do believe that we are making change and that we're winning tangible victories by having someone like Tanua in a position that can bring and leverage real resources for our community. And as these private investors who now are beginning to see South Los Angeles. The beauty of South Los Angeles that we see and the beauty of South Los Angeles that they see is not the same beauty. And as they, work and come into our community, we have to be an organized force to ensure that the blood, sweat, and tears that our community has put forward to make 15 an hour the minimum wage, the bottom, the line, that it is our community that benefits from any job opportunities, from any opportunities around housing, that we don't lose our eye and make sure that young people really do begin to see a difference in their schools when public funds are coming from Prop 30, that we do that hard work to make sure that the resources actually make it to the community. And I'm glad that Marquise Harris-Dawson, who's now the councilman for the 8th Council District, is a champion. But part of why he can be successful in the job that he has now is because the community is going to hold him accountable and keep him honest to make sure that not only does he represent the district, but that he represents the larger South LA community, and that he does the organizing that he learned how to do in South Los Angeles at the city council level, because we need the city council and the mayor and all the city leaders to see the beauty in South LA that we know and see ourselves. So thank you.
By the way, I know that Marquise knows he's being held accountable. But also, I just want to lift up one thing you said, which is there's a difference, there's a beauty in beating the odds, but there's more beauty in changing the odds. So that more people have a chance to succeed rather than a few that get the special funnel chance into these great programs. So it's good when people understand their responsibility to change those odds. Gloria, you work a lot on jobs, and that's part of what's coming up here, is that as some of this investment comes forward, there are going to be job opportunities. How do we make sure they actually accrue to the residents of South Central Los Angeles?
Okay, so there's a lot that Tanua, Orea, and Pete said. I was taking some notes here, so I'll try to integrate some of those things. You guys just made some stuff illuminate in my own mind. So I'll talk about jobs, but I guess first I want to make sure that it's clear about like these victories that Orea was just talking about, why we were able to win them. And so the reality is that folks like Larry Frank, Manuel Pastor, Anthony Thigpen, Congressmember Karen Bass, Supervisor Mark Ridley Thomas, Miguel Contreras, Maria Elena Durazo, and I can go on and on and on. Way back when, when you're talking about Weed and Seed and Rebuild LA, during this time where all these resources were coming into our communities, they weren't coming in for us. And that was well known way back when during Rebuild LA, all the way up until now with this name change. The name didn't change for the people who live here now. There is an agenda that's at play. South LA is a hot spot. Developers love South Los Angeles. The stadium's being built. We're having all these corridors now, these transportation corridors and transit lines to get you from here to there. That's not for the communities that live here. And so they knew this way back when and built these organizations that focused on power building. And here we are all these years later, and we can give you a plethora of victories, but the bottom line, one of those victories is just a campaign. Ultimately, it's about making sure that we're elevating the power and voice of communities in South Los Angeles. And folks think about integrated voter engagement and the power building there. It's real measurable power that we're building. We are tracking folks in a database. We are intentionally building power in districts because we recognize that the electoral arena is one arena of struggle where we can affect change. And the voters really is where all the power is at. But I think the dominant theory of change that we all tend to go to is getting a progressive in office. If you get the most progressive person and place them in office, then we're going to get all the change that we need, right? People tried to have that narrative with President Obama. They try to have it with every progressive we put in office. But the reality is you can get the most progressive person in office and put them inside of an institution that already has values and a politic. And there's corporate interests, there's lobbyists, there's financial interests that's pulling this person towards a different agenda that's not the community's agenda. And so you have that most progressive person in there being pulled. And you can ask the question, does the person change or does the institution change? And so that one person tends to compromise, and with the best intention, instead of aiming for the kind of policies that we need and that communities need, they end up aiming for policies that they can actually do and implement within the confines of that institution. And that's not to say that that model isn't an effective one, because we do need to get progressives in office, but it just doesn't begin and end there. The real power is with people like us on the outside, pulling them towards our agenda and our interests and our vision. So I tend to think about some of those lessons, and when we're talking about voting and the impacts and inside-outside strategy, that's really one strategy that has proven effective. And Orea mentioned some of the victories that we've won, and we didn't win them alone. So any of our organizations can tout these victories, but we know, as Pete mentioned earlier, that our communities don't live in silos. Our communities live at the intersection of issues. So we are tasked with coming together across those issues, across regions, across campaigns, and really working together to build power for local communities. And that's kind of this new moment that we're in right now. And when we're thinking about jobs, so Scope has a model that really is about creaming our communities in, because all too often with any program, it tends to cream communities like South LA right out of them. And so we're like, what are the models that you can build? Because we believe that if you build a program for the communities facing the greatest barriers, who are dealing with the toughest burdens, who tend to be the poorest, if you can construct a program or a campaign that benefits those communities, it's truly only then that you have a program that benefits everyone. And all too often, people are just creaming the top. And so those are the models that are not effective. And so for us, it's trying to make sure that we have a career ladder that is bringing local communities into unionized jobs, having career ladders, having training opportunities, recognizing and identifying the barriers that people face every day, which may be like not having transportation. So how can labor work with us to provide bus tokens? It may be not being able to pass math and English. So how do we provide tutoring for folks to actually pass their exams so that they can actually get placed in a good paying job? So for us, the onus is on us to figure out what are the models and the strategies that can be replicated that actually benefit communities that look like all of us on this stage.
Great, thanks. I've got to say, while you were talking, I kept wanting to say, can I hear an amen? Larry, that's actually a perfect segue. I mean, that's what you do, is to think about workforce development. Can you talk a little bit about that and about Slate C, which is actually a pretty interesting way of trying to take these incoming investments and make sure they actually pay off for community members?
Yeah. So I landed in an amazing place, after doing huge amounts of organizing, really learning labor, really learning workforce development in the city. I find myself at a technical college with 70% of its programming in career technical education that has 24,000 students, 90% from South Los Angeles, right? With all of the hopes and dreams that you can imagine that they carry with them. And so the work that we did, in the city to build out the project labor agreements that require the local hire and the disadvantaged workers, the leverage opportunities. I'm actually able to sort of play all that work out, in the real world of South Los Angeles right now. So I think we did about 400 placements into joint apprenticeship, this year from our students. We have 3,400 students in construction technology at Trade Tech. We just, we have a welding shop, which we just put $5 million in, that, at 70 stations, we just, we got 24 people that are working down at SpaceX right now. I mean, so the few opportunities that do exist, this is an interesting moment for South Los Angeles and for the middle skills jobs that everybody else has sort of walked away from. But we actually have now, we're in the position to connect that community of South Los Angeles to those opportunities. And we have the pipelines in place, we have the relationships in place, and we have the possibilities to put some of those things in place. There's obviously a huge long ways to go. There's huge, issues in terms of preparedness for college for a lot of those students. But, I was there for just 6 months when I got the phone calls to say, hey, we missed our chance to be a promise zone the first time around, right? And I'm here just 6 months. I don't know how this works yet, but then I got the fifth call from Karen Bass that says, Larry, you have to do this. And I was thinking USC should do this, right? But honestly, Trade Tech, is not a bad place to have a platform for this work. USC, honestly, is somewhat of an island in South Los Angeles. Maybe in terms of the 20,000 students, I'm not sure. 300, 400 from South Los Angeles, right? But Trade Tech has 20,000 students from South Los Angeles. So we said, okay, we're going to try to figure this out. We got Gary Painter from USC to help us. We got Hedy Nam, who's a graduate from Pierre, to come help us. We got a real interesting intermarriage to try to figure these pieces out. But we did a strength-based approach to a promise zone from South LA. And by the way, I hear the rebranding. The restaurant across the street from my office on Olive in South LA brands himself as a restaurant in historic South Central Los Angeles. So it's coming, folks. It's coming. Right? We live in South Central now, guys. Right. Historic South Central. But so what is new? So what is new is honestly, the investment in South LA is number one, schools. School bond, we've put probably about 70 new schools in South LA. Has it impacted graduation rates? It has some. Not enough. Has it impacted the college-going culture? It has some. Not enough, right? But it is a building block to sort of build on. It's a strength that South LA, never had Gustus Hawkins before we have it now. We never had Maya Angelou. We never had, there's about 50 schools we've never had before that are places to do organizing and work. Number one, we had the Blue Line, but we got the Expo Line. The Expo Line actually brings you, even though it's not necessarily about that, part of it just, cuts right through South LA, but if we do this right, it's access to the second largest job market in LA, which is Century City, Santa Monica, et cetera, and it also takes us right downtown. Right? And then the Crenshaw, the third largest job market, is down by the airport. Right? And so now we're going to get a shot at those jobs too for South LA in terms of the Crenshaw line being built. So we have about 25 fixed rail transit stops in South Los Angeles. And we have the possibility of investment around transit-oriented communities. So the number one issue in South LA has always been there's no investment. We looked when I first got to City Hall how many applications there were in South Los Angeles for entitlements. And it was down, I think, literally around 25. No, there were 52. There were like 1,400 on the west side, and there were 52 in South LA, and they were like, moving lot lines when I looked at them. So the number one issue always was investment, but now on the heels of that being the last remaining affordable housing, barely affordable housing, is going to be gentrification. So it is, it is the big challenge. And then, schools, we built all these schools, but on the heels of it, is now the charter movement, which looked great in the beginning, but now it's impacting the viability of public schools, right? So there's complexity playing out in terms of opportunities, challenges, but I do a quick story is that most of the country doesn't get South LA, at least yet.
Oh, yeah.
Right? And so when we did our first round application for the South LA Promise Zone, there was already one in here. No, you'll never get one for South LA. You already got one in LA. There's only 6 in the country. Give it up. And sure enough, we didn't get accepted, the first round. You're allowed to go meet with the raters and find out what happens, right? And we talked to all the raters as to why we didn't get it. And the first thing they said, well, you only got 1 point out of 5 on housing need. I said, well, how did you measure housing need? He said, vacancy rate. It's standard with vacancy rate nation. I said, that's a Detroit definition of housing need. We have 2, 3 families fighting to live in the same apartment, the worst homelessness in America, the most unaffordability. How could we have 1 out of 5? He says, well, that's the way we measured it, right? And then the second thing they said, and on unemployment, you got 1 out of 5 as well. I said, how could we get 1 out of 5 points on the issue of jobs needs, right? And they said, well, unemployment was only officially 13%, and we have communities with 17, 18%. I said, well, do you know that we have 1.2 million people that don't show up on the radar, that they don't have the right to work, and they're not going to show up on what you're showing us? And it's not about unemployment, it's about underemployment in Los Angeles. People working 2 jobs just to get by, right? It's the barbell economy. It's like, and so, but the thing that was brilliant about it is that we had all these organizations agreeing on how to work together. We had 64 organizations in the room. We put them in the room when Karen Bass and Lucille Roybal Allard got Julian Castro, who oversees HUD, that was responsible for that decision. And there was in between the 2 applications. And we got Pierre, right, Jennifer and Manuel, some money to put together the academic argument, right? And we got Julian Castro in the room. And then we sat Manuel next to him on the bus tour of poverty in South Los Angeles. And by the way, Promise Zone 1 had to reach all the way from East Hollywood into Koreatown to pick up all of Pico Union to get to the required 34% unemployment. 34% below the federal poverty line. On the natural, even including Leimert Park and a few other places, and USC, right? On the natural, the South LA Promise Zone is 46% of the residents live below the federal poverty line, and that number is very, very small number in terms of income. 46%. So you can see why South LA is hungry for representation and hungry to be understood, right? And so got them in the room, and we got the next round came out, and it didn't have measurements around unemployment. They couldn't figure it out. So they said, we're just not going to even measure the issue of jobs. We're not going to even measure the issue of housing. We hadn't done it the previous round when the first Promise Zone got it. And then we wrote our application, and then we found out that we got the 2nd highest score out of 114 applications in the country for South Los Angeles. And so we have a Promise Zone. We're not exactly sure what it's going to mean because there's been a little bit of change at the federal level, right? We got Ben Carson as our, person overseeing HUD.
That would be good for South Africa,
But
right?
ironically, the new map has 15 out of the 22 Promise Zones in red states, and we actually think it's going to survive. So preference points, anybody working in South LA, preference points on federal applications, and we've already won a couple. We've got a long ways to go.
That's all right.
But it's the point being, people don't understand South LA, but we have organizations in South. We are an organizationally rich community because of the investments that have happened since the riots, and it all does stem back to the riots. And some of the most important organizations, like Scope, like COCO, all just literally came out of the cradle of the LA uprising. So it's an interesting environment we live in today.
Let's give it up for South LA.
Yeah.
So we have a few minutes for questions or comments. Then I'm going to give the panel a chance to talk about what lesson should be pulled out of South LA for the rest of the nation. But we've got Preston back there, and I think Sheila with a mic. By the way, here are the rules, which is you actually have to ask a question. They will not let go of the mic. They won't. They work for me. They know they can't. If you're going too long, I'll raise one hand. If you're going way too long, I'll raise two, which will be a sign to the audience to thunderously applaud whatever point you were just making. So with the fear of God in you, does anybody really want to say anything? No. Any comments, things that came from their questions? Let's move up here. Sheila's going to bring forward a mic. And then Preston, I think you can move to the middle. So, yep, hang on to the mic.
Hi, Beth Steckler with Move LA. Thank you so much for this conference and this panel. Just amazing and very thought-provoking. My question is, what is the single most important thing or the 7 most important things to do to stop displacement so we get investment and people staying in the neighborhood?
That's a very easy question, so Tanua.
First of all, we've got to recognize it for what it is. And for, on one hand, I know certainly communities are open to change in a lot of ways. There can be some change. The challenge we have is when we do not think about, as community residents of South Central Los Angeles, we don't think about purchasing beyond sort of our own homes even. So pooling resources together to ensure that we're purchasing commercial businesses or just commercial property, and that we're purchasing as well multifamily dwellings. In the work that I do, I've got more than $100 million available, ready, and willing to put on the street to ensure that there's affordable housing in these communities. But we've got to take the time to really promote and have developers who are willing to do that. So there's some resources there. Beyond that, we've got to attract capital from sources other than the traditional institutions. Right now, really the only place we can get capital is from banks. So I'm looking forward to hearing from those benefactors who have resources and are willing to put a social mission behind those to ensure that there is capital available for affordable housing and economic development activities. One more thing I'll say is when it comes to home ownership, that American dream is not dead, and our communities deserve to have access to that. Too many people have said because of the recession that really poor people and people of color, they don't know how to manage a mortgage. Well, we know that's not true, and that they were targeted by the subprime industry. And for African Americans, 92% of their wealth is in their home, and for Latinos, it's close to 80%. So we've got to make sure that cities are doing what they can, including putting on the table soft second programs so that our families can get the down payment when they're only making $15 an hour. We know in this town that simply is not enough. So I look forward to working with organizations like those across the table who are in communities, organizing, making sure that we're gaining access to that land that we can to ensure affordability, and to the land so that we can make sure small businesses that we care about and we want to see continue to contribute to the culture and the place that is South Central Los Angeles are there in the community.
Great answer. It reminds me that it's not that black and brown people can't manage their finances, it's that Wall Street can't manage a financial system. So, yeah. No, Preston's not going to let you hold it, so go ahead.
I'm sorry.
So.
Hi.
Manuel.
Thank you for this very inspiring panel. I feel very fired up. I'm from Los Angeles, but in graduate school in Philadelphia, where there are so many academic conversations about that treat multiracial solidarity with great suspect. Oh, there's so much anti-blackness in those multiracial projects. And I am always deemed the romantic person from California talking about black-brown solidarity. But I want to hear you all talk about, like, what would you shout out to the nation about the reality of black-brown solidarity and multiracial coalition here?
I'm happy to answer too, but you want to start?
Let's start with Pete.
Okay,
Yeah.
Victor, sorry.
I'm like, Victor now.
No.
So,
Apologize.
no, I know that. So a couple of things. We've definitely been approached by many foundations and schools and others to talk about our motto of black-brown work. And the response I give to folks quickly is we don't have a motto of black-brown work. We have a history of black and brown people building the city of Los Angeles, right? When I think about coming up in South Central Los Angeles, I think about the periods, right? So there's always a conversation about tension, but I think about the periods of no tension, right? And so I think about the 80s, I think about hip hop, I think about making tamales in 87 with my neighbors, right? I think about the ways in which we were taking care of one another, right? I think about when especially in my neighborhood, when I look at the black and brown unified families, right? And I say, well, why don't researchers see this, right? Have there been times in periods of tension? Of course there has. And where does that tension come from? It comes from misinformation. It comes from other people telling our stories for us. Dr. Ruthie Gilmore said something, she says a lot of wonderful things, but there's a definition that she sort of says that I think about right now. It says capitalism defines us or divides us and racism enshrines it, right? And so when I think about it like that, and I think about folks who are fleeing other countries, right, in Central America, war-torn countries, and I think that you have the man or you have white supremacy saying to them, black people are lazy, don't worry about it. Without saying, actually, the real story is there's a tradition of organizing in the labor movement with black people, and once black people are working, they're going to change the conditions for everyone, and that's where anti-blackness is rooted. And so I don't believe in all of these tensions that are dividing us, right? And when I talk about models, I say once people work together and once people are able to point to the systems that are oppressing them, we're together all the time, from day one until the close of night.
By the way, there's a very good report about this called Roots Raíces. Some of you may know that we wrote it. So maybe a word, because you guys are very intentional at community coalition, scope as well, but just for time reasons, let's hear about community coalition, then we'll do a pass for everybody on big lesson from South LA for the rest of the United States. But you're very intentional, particularly with youth, because they're often in schools where there's a lot of segregation, so trying to bring them together. Can you talk a little bit about that?
So a couple of things. I think on a personal level, I do consider myself as somebody who in large part was raised by the African American community, because when I came to South Los Angeles, we were one of a handful of families on my street. And I think that is a big reason why I'm so proud of being a part of South Central, of being a part of a black and brown community, of standing for racial justice as an individual. The second thing is, I have had the fortune of walking into an organization right out of college that was committed to black and brown unity, and that has done that for 27 years. And just like Pete said, does intentional work to deal with anti-black issues or sentiment that comes up, but also anti-immigrant and anti-brown issues that come up occasionally along the way because of misunderstandings, because of how the media portrays our people and how seduced people can get when they're having a challenging time because of poverty and just the stress, right, of living in poverty. But one of the things that we do, and Pete spoke to this, is we have people work on issues that they can both relate to. And so our work around education reform, bringing our black and brown youth together, really looking at how young people were being over-criminalized on their school campuses, working on issues of child welfare and grandmothers stepping up to care for relative children, both black and brown women, keeping families together so that children don't have to go into the private foster care system. Currently, we're doing a poll. We're conducting 5,000 polls to look at public safety. And when residents are talking about it, they're talking about law and order and the problem with our communities being over-policed, right, with punitive policies, and immigration, and children who are talking about their fear of having their parents deported and how their parents are essentially being criminalized when they're put in detention centers. So having residents come to the same room to talk about those lived experiences goes a long way for getting people's commitment to work together on issues and to stand united in how we present our community, and making the commitment to address issues that may come up along the way, I think is the second important piece. And so in terms of moving into the future, like, I really believe that what we can contribute to the rest of the country as South Los Angeles is that South LA is really a thriving, dynamic,
That's right.
community that represents what the rest of the country is going to look like by 2040, according to Policy Link, right, which you're on the board of directors of. And
So it must be right.
the data, the research, right? But I think that more so important than the data and the research, the country is changing. The rest of the country is beginning to look more and more like communities like South, Central, South Los Angeles. How do we do the work to really support neighborhoods or cities in other part of the country that are doing the hard work of working alongside with our Black sisters and brothers, right, to work for racial justice so that they can receive both the support and the validation by the work that's taking place here in South Los Angeles.
Great. So Ray just took us into the close, and so Larry and the rest of you, 1 minute each, whatever you want to say, but maybe a lesson you think for the rest of the country. You just wasted 5 seconds with that. Man, look, dude.
I'll make an observation on something that I am observing in South Los Angeles that I think is quite remarkable, is that you have obviously a demographic shift, but also a remarkably graceful shift in some leadership. So how do you go from Karen Bass to Marquise Harris-Dawson to Alberto Rotana, right? How do you go from Denise Fairchild over CD Tech over to Benny Torres? How do you go from Lark Galloway Gilliam over at California Health Council to Cecilia Flores? But there is a little bit, you know, as there's a demographic shift, that's a frightening thing to think about. I mean, loss of power is very different than gaining power, right, in a community. So it's a very complex thing, but the graceful way it has happened in those 3 organizations is deserving of a whole lot of respect as we sort of watch from the outside to figure those pieces out. Quite honestly, elected leadership hasn't changed, even though the population has changed at every level. You know, there's a little sliver that Lucille has, right? But, you know, from Congress to, but, you know, again, it's kind of core, right? The numbers aren't changed yet. But it's a complex thing that's going to be something that will be in front of us as a community at some point. How to do that gracefully. It only happens if there's intentionality about it. It happens gracefully. It happens and that there is a focus on what we're accomplishing together. But it's going to be one of the complex pieces of work in South Los Angeles over the next period of time.
Great, thank you. Gloria, your takeaway.
So I'm going to play on this theme of South LA is the future. So as South LA goes Los Angeles. As Los Angeles goes California. And as California goes the nation. So as I'm sitting up here, I'm reminded of the fact that California wasn't always a blue state. It used to be a red state. And we often forget, but you can think about George the Duke, you can think about Reagan, You can think about all of the policies from Prop 209, from Prop 27, 227, thank you.
184.
184, 3 strikes, right?
Yeah,
you could go
184.
on and on about all of these initiatives that started here and swept across the country. And today, California is a blue state, and dare I say, you know, everyone romanticizes us, right? And so that didn't just happen. It happened from organizations like all of us up here and individuals who are in this room and beyond this room that transform that narrative. So it really is about owning our power to really affect change and to change conditions. And lastly, I'll say, connected to that, I feel like the reason that things were able to materialize is because these individuals and these organizations are committed to making sure that race and equity is at the center of the analysis, solutions, campaigns, because if we don't do that, what ends up happening is we can have the greatest programs, have the greatest campaign victories, but the same structural inequities exist, the same concentrations of race, or the same concentrations of wealth and power exist, and quite frankly, racism still exists. And so it's really critical to make sure that we're leading with race and equity front and center.
Great, thank you. Tanua, your last thought.
Well, I'm just so excited to be part of this panel. One of the things that I was hearing and feeling is that South Central Los Angeles has some indigenous leaders here on this stage who came out of something that some would say was ugly and terrible. And so, you know, really glad to have that. But at the same time, we're going to need that leadership, and we're going to need our sage leadership as well, with the wisdom and the experience of the many decades before. So really glad to be part of this going forward. Part of what we need to be able to say as well to young people is that indigenous leadership is necessary, and it's necessary to stay. It's necessary to be part of the fight. It's necessary to continue that struggle. All too often, I know my peers and colleagues decide that there are more comfortable places to be and more comfortable things to do. And I want to make sure that these organizations continue to have that cadre of leaders coming up and coming forward. And I'm hoping that as communities, we're thinking about what is that indigenous leadership, how are we cultivating that, and how are we making sure that they continue to be part of the fight going forward.
Thank you. Pete, your last thought, lesson for the country.
Wow, I thought me and Area was left out of that one.
That's because she jumped in and she did her last thought.
Yeah. Cool. So really quickly, I think looking forward, I'm really optimistic in terms of where we go from here. I look down at the panel. I think about group-centered leadership. I look at these Super Soul sisters and the work that they've done in our communities, and I know we are in good hands. I also believe...
Hey. Clap it up, clap it up.
I also believe that art has no address, right? And so when I look at the cultural work that's going on, that's no longer disjointed, I love it, Manuel, that you started with Kendrick Lamar. I'm looking over at Larry Aubrey, who most of y'all don't know is a professional trumpeter and played Central Avenue. And so we have those echoes of music and culture. And I'm just really thinking about how our walls become our tapestries for our visions, right? And I'm thinking about the music that's going to help us build a vision for staying. I'm under no illusion that the pressure is on. When you think about gentrification, once you see it, it's almost too late, right? But I'm very clear with the folks that's in this room and with the folks and the leadership that's on this stage, we will fight. We are the people of the day before yesterday, the day after tomorrow. We have always been here. We're resilient and we still stand. And on that note, that was it.
So I'm going to make one last comment, and I'll hand things over to Gary. And Aurea, you know I didn't pass you up, right? I just let you lead off.
No, but I do want to invite people.
She's an organizer, of course.
I do want to invite people to what the LA Weekly has said is the most powerful art exhibit commemorating the 1992 Unrest at Community Coalition, Reimagining Justice. It will be up until Saturday, and we have the Future Fest. So Normandy in Florence, rally, and then march, and music festival. Thank you.
Oh, good. Thank you. Thank you for doing that, because that got me out of repeating that. So I was trying to think about how to close this, and I actually didn't have much of a plan until Pete started talking. Because
Is that
Pete,
a good or a bad thing?
no, it's a good thing, because Pete, you're going to leave here and go visit your mom. And what it reminded me of was the following thing. I was at a meeting a couple of years ago. It was about the economic future of Black America. There were about 25 of us there. About 3 of us, not African American, but participating in the conversation. And this meeting, aside from being really great substantively, had one of the best icebreakers I've ever seen. And the icebreaker was to have people go around and say, "My mama told me." Like, what did your mother tell you that really stuck with you? And like, people said these really inspiring things about church and values and all this great stuff. My mom grew up in Spanish Harlem. She was pretty tough. Most of what she told me was pretty much like what a truck driver would tell someone they were angry at. So I was trying to figure out what I could say in polite company. But literally the first thing that jumped to my mind, and this is something my mom told me, never cross a picket line. Never cross a picket line. And what she meant by that was pretty literal. Her family was a labor family, but she meant something bigger. She meant stand in solidarity with people who are struggling. If they are on a line and on a picket line, you are not supposed to cross that picket line. You are supposed to stand in solidarity with those people. I think what we have here is a history of people demonstrating solidarity together, providing an example of how community can come together, and it is up to us and the rest of Los Angeles to never cross that picket line, to stand in solidarity with the people of South LA, to come up with a model of development that's not about displacement, to reduce the system of incarceration and create the ways for people to re-enter into the labor force, for those of us who are not immigrants to care about the deportation. Right. It is time for us to stand in solidarity, to never cross a picket line, because that's what my mama told me. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
You're just going to drop the mic on there.
Thank you, Manuel. You know, I mean, today was a real privilege for me to be able to host day 1 of the conference. You know, it was all-star panel after all-star panel, and what a finale. Thank you again.
Hey.